So, hi everyone, and welcome to another episode of Unpacking Possibility. I'm your host, Tracy Stein, and as always, I'm so happy to be here with you today. And actually, today it's just going to be us, you and me. And I want to talk about something that maybe you can identify with, because I think most people have had this experience before. And it's the mistakes people make when they want to be liked. Right? When you want to be liked and you feel maybe a little socially anxious or awkward. And I think that's happened to more of us actually over the last few years because we've spent so much time either alone or just with a few people. Our social distancing has changed the way we think about social interactions, and it might feel a little bit rusty as we step back into the in-person world of socially getting together with people. You know, it's always different too when you're interacting with people who are people you know well versus people maybe you don't know well or you don't know them at all really. And maybe you're at something for work or you're at a social function, but it can really bring up unexpected awkwardness and anxiety for people. And again, so many of us have had more of our interactions be Zoom oriented or, otherwise virtual or with a select and smaller group of people. So if you notice that you've been feeling a little bit rusty getting back out into the world, please know that you're not alone. And again, today we're going to talk about the more common mistakes, about 7 of them, that people make when they're feeling a little rusty or awkward and they really want to make a good impression. And then we'll talk about some things you can do to feel better and do better. Okay, so let's jump right in. Regardless of what the type of social setting is, you may find that you are speaking with people either, again, you don't know that well or at all, or, for whatever reason, maybe you're a person who's pretty introverted and now you've spent even more time alone, right? So what do you do? If you're feeling awkward, one thing that people often do is they overtalk, right? So they will be in conversation with someone, again, an acquaintance, a friend, doesn't matter, and they'll be talking without listening, right? It can feel like compulsive over-talking. And you'll notice this because if you step back, you'll say, okay, what percentage of this conversation was I talking versus listening in a really engaged way? And again, it can be driven by anxiety or rustiness. If you're like me and you have that kind of ADHD brain, and I'm not exaggerating, it's true, it's a family trait, you might find that your mind is kind of really a little bit all over the place sometimes, where you're noticing 10,000 things instead of the 2 things you really want to be focused on, like the person in front of you. Your mind can feel like it's moving a mile a minute. And so if you're doing number 1, the over-talking and the talking without listening, which I'm kind of combining, it's just something worth noticing. You're probably going to reflect more after, unless someone says, hey, I was just trying to tell you about this. But pay attention. Again, none of these things are the end of the world because they're all things we can change, and no one's perfect, and you don't need to be either. So if you find your anxiety rising right now as I talk about this, just, it's okay, and just breathe, right? We'll get through this together. All right, so number 2, bragging. Now, you probably have noticed this when you're in conversation with people at school or at work and so forth. And again, maybe it's you. And so bragging really is a way of trying to show ourselves and other people that we're worthy in some way. Because I think what happens is there's a hidden fear that if we're not spectacular, we won't be seen as worth talking to or hanging out with and so forth. And again, competitive environments like school and work can be especially likely to bring this out if this is how you respond to social anxiety and stress and so forth. But you can find that even at a party. So people can brag about anything, really, their job, their house, their car, their achievements, their partner. And you all know someone who's done this, and we've probably all been guilty of, talking about things that make us feel good, something that's good about us. And we want to kind of show ourselves in our best light. But the problem is bragging usually has the exact opposite effect. It creates distance and not connection. I had a colleague years ago who I won't identify, but who did this constantly and had some awareness of this. But it made it impossible to form a friendship with this person. And on the surface, we actually had a lot of interests and things in common. But, like many people, this person was raised in a family where competition was not only encouraged, it was almost like expected. So this person had to constantly try to best their siblings. Everybody was always vying for favorite child position. So either being the smartest or the most interesting or the most well-traveled or the best athlete or whatever it was. But again, it's a way we try and make ourselves feel better and show ourselves in a great light. It could be like your connections. Look at who you know. But at the end of the day, it just creates distance. So if this is a tendency you have, it's just worth noticing. Okay, number 3, jumping in with the, yeah, me too, every time somebody says something that you can identify with. Now, this can happen because we're just really excited. Yay, somebody has interests that we have, or maybe it's that they've gone through something difficult and we're trying to show, yeah, I get you. I get it. I understand. We share this thing in common, right? And a lot of times when we look for connection, we look for common ground. Now, again, once in a while, this is fine. It's not that you can't share that, oh, you've had a similar experience. But the downside is if somebody's sharing something difficult, for example, it can feel like you're trying to co-opt their sadness or their anxiety or their grief or their stress, when maybe they just want you to be a sympathetic listener, even if you have had the same thing happen. This often comes up actually when people are telling you about an illness they've had, right? And again, there are times when it's appropriate to share a little bit like, you know what, yeah, I've been through that, but you'll be able to get through that too, I think. And this is what was helpful for me. That's one thing. But if you notice that every time somebody brings something up that you can identify with, like, yeah, I have a kitchen too, or something, you want to pay attention to it. Because again, it has the opposite effect. People want to have ownership over the emotions they're sharing with you or the stories that they are sharing with you. And by you giving them a little space, it actually creates an intimacy with them. They're reaching out to you in a way that can foster intimacy. And your way of having emotional connection and intimacy is just to be listening and compassionate. Again, even if you share a little bit about your journey, you want to let their airtime be their airtime. And same thing with something that they like to do. Again, it's totally appropriate to share, I like bike riding, or I like this or that, or I love pets, or whatever it is. But you want to have some balance. I want you to think about conversational space as almost a little bit like real estate, right? And by real estate, I don't even mean just like your home, but I mean it can be just where you're standing on the street. You don't want to step into somebody else's personal space, and you want to think of conversational space a little bit like that. Okay, so number 4, just plain old not listening. And again, we've all been guilty of this. If you're exhausted because you were up late, or you're just feeling a little foggy because your seasonal allergies are kicking in, or you've just got a lot else on your mind. We all have that where we just find ourselves drifting off for a moment. And not everybody's got equally naturally good listening skills. So it takes more energy for some of us to develop that. And one of the solutions we'll talk about in a few minutes can really be especially effective for that. But you might also just feel like you're not that interested in what someone else is saying. And that happens to all of us. And what I would just say is you don't have to talk to any one person for an endless amount of time, but see if there's something you can find that you can be genuinely curious about. Right? And if worst comes to worst, if it's just not a connection and there's not a flow, you probably won't spend as much time speaking with each other. Again, if this is at a cocktail party or a community event or something for your school or work, you're going to need to probably engage for a certain amount of time, but then it's perfectly fine to move on. But while you are with each other, it's really important to be present. Okay. So number 5, not listening because you're looking around the room. And how many times have we all done that? I think everyone's done that. Everyone's had that done to them at some point. And to be honest, it never feels good. And if you're on the other end of the conversation, you notice it. Even if people politely are trying to seem like they don't, they usually do. So we can do that because we're anxious. We can do that because we're anxious about how to extricate ourselves in a way that's graceful, right? It could have nothing to do with the person across from you, but you could be thinking, how do I do this thing that typically is awkward for people in a way that is not awkward if possible? You might not want to be the person who is left awkwardly or feeling awkwardly alone when the other person extricates themselves. So you could be thinking about that. But it does come across as being uninterested. And again, it gets in the way of connection. So it's something that takes practice, but gets better with practice, is that when you're talking to someone, attend to them. Because remember, you're probably only talking to someone for a few minutes, which is a pretty short amount of time. So be present for that amount of time. Number 6, this one's really kind of uncomfortable. But I'm going to mention it because it happens when people feel socially awkward. For some people, it's really reflexive. And I don't even mean just exaggerating things that would fall under bragging, which I mentioned earlier on. But number 6 is making stuff up. So just creating something that isn't true. And I don't think this is something most people do, but I think some people do it because they wish it was true, and maybe they've been thinking about something to the point that it feels like it is and it's not. But this actually is something that goes a little beyond that. I'm going to give you an example. So years ago, I'd gotten a job that I was happy about, but I actually kind of like to be private about a lot of the things that I've got going on, and maybe that's the more introverted part of me, but. And it realized that this was very triggering for somebody else. Having nothing to do with their capability or not, it just was something. This is somebody who tends to be more competitive generally. And competitive not in the healthy competition way, but in the way of, if I am not the best, then I don't even exist. Or, the only way I can feel okay with you is to best you, to be better than you, to be more XYZ, successful, this, that, the other thing. And this person told me very clearly that they were just about to be named to this position at their work, and said it repeatedly. And it was a very specific job title. It was a very specific role. And they mentioned it multiple times, and I said, "Oh, that's great. I'm happy for you." And actually, this is, I actually feel bad for this person because this must have been incredibly painful for them. But not only did they not get that title, they actually got kind of, ushered out of their job. So I remember that they felt so strongly that they had to create this reality in which they had this promotion, and to make sure I knew it. And it wasn't true. And it was, in fact, the opposite of what was happening. But that creates distance, right? And the thing is, this person probably has no idea that I wouldn't have needed them to have this job for me to think well of them. It wasn't even on my radar. Because, for most of us, if you think about it, we're mostly more concerned with what's going on for us in our day-to-day lives than whether somebody else is checking off every box on our list, right? Because their stuff is their stuff and our stuff is our stuff. So this is something, if you tend to do it, you definitely should consider seeing somebody about it, because you don't need to do it to be worth something. And it can take more to work through it, but you can. And number 7, what happens sometimes if people want to be liked and they're feeling anxious, or they feel awkward, or they feel unskilled, and maybe especially if it's been a long time since they've gone out and done anything socially for a while, is they just avoid it, right? So either they only hang out with a few specific people who make them feel perfectly safe and comfortable, or they just avoid going out altogether. So they get invitations to things and maybe they say yes, and at the last minute they cancel. Or maybe they just say no right off the bat. And what happens, though, unfortunately, is when we avoid anxiety-provoking things, when we avoid things that make us feel less secure, well, our brains start saying, oh, if I just avoid this and never do it, I will feel okay. And that's the way I can feel okay. And the problem is then the next time you would otherwise want to go do something social, or have to do it again for work or school or something, or just because it's important socially, you are going to feel way more overwhelmed. Now, again, this is something that it's worth working with a professional if this has been really challenging. Again, we can avoid things because we're afraid of being judged, or we feel like we don't have something interesting to say. And just so you know, I listed these 7 things, but it's not that they're mutually exclusive. You can tend to have a few of these that you might default to depending on the situation and the crowd and how you're feeling that day and so forth. But now that we've talked about those things that are challenging, I want to tell you about a few things you can do. Now, some of you've absolutely heard me mention before, but I'm mentioning them again because they actually work, and they have science behind them to show that they work. And I'm not just making it up. So number 1 should probably always be meditation, mindfulness meditation in particular, for a few reasons. When we tend to feel really anxious, we do something, the psychological term is called catastrophizing. And it just means you make a catastrophe, something horrible, out of something that really isn't that bad, even if it's a little bad, right? So feeling awkward doesn't feel good, and maybe fumbling with your words at a social event or something isn't great, but it's certainly not a catastrophe. An avalanche is a catastrophe. There are many other things in life that are true catastrophes, but feeling a little bit awkward or not making the impression you ideally wanted to make really isn't one of them. And again, mindfulness trains us to step back and look at situations from a more helpful and healthful and objective point of view. So that's always number 1. You will find that if you practice it, in general, you feel less stressed and you recenter much more quickly whenever you're in a situation that might normally trigger a little bit of stress. The other thing is, I want you to remember that rarely, if ever, will a single awkward encounter define you in another person's mind, in your own mind, in general. And if you're letting it define you that way, please don't. Our minds tend to work overtime sometimes to make us suffer, and we don't need to. And I want you to think about it this way, from the other person's perspective, right? We all collect tons of data in our brains every day, like a gazillion bits of data that we're not even fully registering. Our overall impressions of other people tend to also be a little bit more mutable and malleable and changeable, like clay, right? It's something we can shape and reshape a bit. So, look, you might feel that you have a super awkward encounter with somebody and it never really feels quite natural with them. And you know what? Okay, it's not the end of the world, because you're going to meet thousands and thousands of people in your life, whether you realize it or not. And again, most people are much more focused on their own stuff and how they come across than they're focused on you. And the people who need to really nitpick and find a way to judge you negatively no matter what you do, you know what? That's probably not the best place for you to invest your energy, because most people actually aren't like that. And what a great thing that is. But again, people aren't thinking about us as much as we imagine they are, right? They have so many other things to focus on, just like you do. So breathe and recenter and let it go. The other thing you can do is keep interacting with people. Again, the more you do this, the easier it gets. You do get desensitized to anything stressful if you keep doing it. And that's been demonstrated, right? It's been demonstrated in the literature. I mean, if you were afraid of dogs and you have more positive interactions with dogs, that fear is going to decrease. If you have a fear of public speaking, after giving a number of talks, the fear really does go down. And it may or may not ever completely go away, but you'll find that over time, everything becomes more tolerable, the less rare it becomes for you. So actually, the antidote is the thing that scares you. For this and many other things, get out there, keep socializing, just observe, just notice what you notice. Life is to be lived. It's all a journey of learning for everybody, not just you. And again, related to that, just in the scheme of your life, it's highly unlikely that any one interaction or series of interactions even will completely define you. Again, we're always learning and growing. Think of any of these interactions as just a blip on the timeline of your life, right? That thing that bothered you in fourth grade when you had to go write something on the board and didn't get it right, or when you answered a question wrong, or where somebody thought, your outfit was funny looking, or whatever it is, chances are you are not still suffering over that, I hope, right? Because we're all learning, growing. The universe is very mutable and changeable, and what a wonderful thing that is. So again, I hope that if you notice you're dealing with any of these things that make social interactions a little more awkward, know that you can make them better. And now you have a better understanding of the purpose that part of you thinks they serve, but you don't need to do that so much anymore. And you have some nice practical tools that not only help with interacting more comfortably and confidently, but just in general. So again, I'm Tracy Stein. This has been another episode of Unpacking Possibility. I hope you enjoyed the episode. If you do, please remember to like, share, and follow. And until next time, be well.